What happens when the world's cruelest joke turns out to be your last chance at salvation? They sent her to him to be broken. A blind, overweight daughter, a burden to be discarded. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. And they had no idea what she truly was. The wagon wheels screamed against the stones, a sound that matched the one inside Clara's chest. She gripped the rough wooden bench, her knuckles white. Behind her, the laughter of her sisters still echoed. In front of her, only an endless, unseen darkness. Her father hadn't said goodbye. Her mother's last words were a curse. Finally, someone else's problem. The driver, a man paid to haul her away like unwanted cargo, cleared his throat. He's a good man, they say. The rancher, Elias Ward. Clara didn't answer. Good men didn't exist in her world. Men were hammers, and she had always been the nail. The wagon groaned to a stop, the air filled with dust. She heard a heavy gate swing open, the sound of boots on dry earth. A voice cut through the wind, deep and steady. "You can bring her down." There was no pity in it, no cruelty, just a simple command, like he was talking about a sack of flour. This was it, the final humiliation. The driver mumbled something, and Clara felt a hand on her elbow. She swung her legs over the side, her worn shoes sinking into the dirt. She stood, pulling her shawl tight, lifting her chin toward the sound of the man's breathing. She could feel his stare. She'd felt stares her whole life, stares that mocked her size, stares that dismissed her for her sightless eyes. But this was different. This wasn't a stare that judged. It was a stare that measured. "What's your name?" he asked. "Clara," she whispered. "Clara," he repeated. The name sounded different in his mouth, solid, real. "I'm Elias Ward." He stepped closer. She could smell the scent of leather, dust, and something like clean, cold water. He didn't touch her. He just stood there, a wall of silence between them. "Your family said you were a burden," he said, his voice flat. Clara flinched. The truth was a whip. "They lied," he said. Her head snapped up. She couldn't see his face, but she felt his words like a physical touch. He wasn't mocking her. He was correcting a fact. The driver cleared his throat, eager to be gone. The wagon rattled away, leaving Clara alone in the vast, empty prairie with a man she couldn't see. She was standing at the edge of the world, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of scars. Elias Ward didn't move for a long moment. He just watched her, watched the way the wind pulled at her dress, the way she stood her ground, like a weathered rock against the endless plains. "You've had a long ride," he said finally. "Come inside. Supper's on." He didn't wait for an answer. He just turned and walked toward the house, the sound of his boots a steady rhythm for her to follow. She hesitated, then took a step, and another. The cabin was warm. It smelled of roasting meat and wood smoke. A fire crackled in the hearth. Elias pulled out a chair for her at a heavy wooden table. "Eat," he said. She ate. The stew was rich and hot, and with every spoonful, a piece of the ice that had lived in her chest for 20 years began to melt. He didn't speak again until she had cleaned the bowl. "Why did they really send you here, Clara?" he asked, his voice low. She froze, the spoon halfway to her mouth. The old fear, the familiar shame, came rushing back. "They were ashamed of me," she whispered. "I'm too much, too big, too blind." Elias let out a short, harsh sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "I've seen men twice your size run from a shadow. I've seen men with perfect eyes who couldn't see the truth right in front of them." He leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "They didn't send you here because you're too much. They sent you here because they were afraid of you." Clara shook her head, confused. "Afraid? Of me?" "They thought I'd break you," he said. "Finish the job they started. They figured a man like me, living out here alone, would either send you packing or crush what was left of your spirit." A chill ran down her spine. It sounded exactly like something her father would do. "But they made a mistake," Elias said, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "What mistake?" "They sent you to the wrong man." That night, Clara slept in a real bed for the first time in years. A bed that didn't feel like a cage. The sounds of the ranch, the lowing of cattle, the nicker of a horse in the barn were a strange and comforting lullaby. But just as she drifted off, a new sound cut through the night. Hoofbeats, more than one rider, moving fast. They weren't just passing by. They were coming straight for the ranch. Elias was already at the window, his rifle in his hand. The moonlight glinted off the cold steel barrel. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "Is it my father?" Elias didn't answer for a moment. He just watched the riders get closer. "No," he said, his voice grim. "It's worse." The riders weren't her father's men. They were harder, meaner. They wore the dust of a long trail, and they carried their guns like they were a part of their own bodies. The man in the lead pulled his horse to a stop just beyond the fence line. Even in the pale moonlight, Clara could hear the sneer in his voice. "Ward, we heard you took on some new livestock, a blind heifer from the Shaw farm." The insult was meant to cut, to provoke. Elias didn't move a muscle. He just stood in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the warm light of the cabin. "You've got no business here, Miller," Elias said, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. Miller. Thomas Miller. The name sent a jolt through Clara. He was the merchant her father had tried to force her to marry, the man whose cruelty was a town legend. "My business is with my property," Miller spat. "Your father promised her to me. A deal's a deal." "She's not a sack of grain, Miller. She's my wife now." The lie was so sudden, so absolute, it stole Clara's breath. She stared at Elias's back, her mind reeling. Miller laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Wife? You married that? You're a bigger fool than I thought. Or maybe you're just desperate." He dismounted, walking toward the porch with a swaggering confidence. "Doesn't matter. I paid a price for her, and I've come to collect." "Get off my land," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "I don't think so." Miller took another step. "I think you're going to hand her over, because if you don't, this pretty little ranch of yours might just have a bad accident with a lit torch." Clara's hands flew to her mouth. She knew it wasn't an idle threat. Men like Miller didn't make threats. They made promises. Elias raised the rifle just enough for the moonlight to catch it. "You take one more step, and the only thing leaving this ranch in a wagon will be your corpse." The standoff hung in the air, thick and heavy. Miller's men shifted in their saddles, their hands moving toward their guns. Then, Clara did something she had never done in her life. She moved toward the danger. She stepped out onto the porch, right beside Elias. She couldn't see Miller, but she turned her face toward the sound of his voice. "I am not your property," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I will never be your property." Miller stared at her, his mouth falling open in shock. He had expected a cowering, broken creature. He hadn't expected defiance. "You hear that?" Elias said. "The lady said no." Miller's shock turned to rage. He lunged for the porch steps. "You stupid cow, I'll—" He never finished the sentence. Elias didn't fire his rifle. He moved with a speed that was terrifying, slamming the butt of the rifle into Miller's gut. The man doubled over, gasping for air. Before he could recover, Elias had him by the collar, hauling him up. "Now you listen to me," Elias snarled, his face inches from Miller's. "You come near her again. You speak her name again. You even think about this ranch again, and I will hunt you down. And I won't stop until I've buried every last one of you." He threw Miller back into the dirt. Miller's men, seeing their leader humiliated, hesitated, then slowly began to back their horses away. Miller scrambled to his feet, clutching his stomach, his face a mask of hate and disbelief. "This isn't over, Ward," he screamed. "Her father wants her silenced. He'll pay double for her now." He stumbled back to his horse and rode off, his men following like beaten dogs. The silence they left behind was deafening. Clara was trembling, her whole body shaking with adrenaline and a terror so deep it felt like it was coming from her bones. Elias turned to her. His rifle was still in his hands, his knuckles white. "What did he mean?" Clara whispered. "Silenced?" Elias looked at her, and the anger in his eyes was replaced by something else, something dark and complicated. "Your father didn't just send you here to get rid of you, Clara," he said, his voice grim. "He sent you here to be buried." The truth hit Clara like a physical blow. Her father hadn't just wanted her gone, he wanted her erased. Miller's words echoed in her mind. Her father wants her silenced. It wasn't just about her blindness, or her size, or her defiance. It was about what she knew, the crooked land deals, the hidden money, the lies that held her family's empire together. She was a witness, and witnesses had a way of disappearing. "They thought Miller would do it," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "They figured he'd marry you, take you to his own ranch, and one day you'd just have an accident. No one would ask questions. No one would care about the blind, unwanted daughter." Clara sank onto the porch steps, her head in her hands. "But why send me here? To you?" Elias was quiet for a long time. He walked to the edge of the porch, staring out at the dark prairie. "Because they knew my story," he said finally. He turned to look at her, his face a mask of old pain. "They knew I lost my first wife, that she died out here alone. They figured I was a broken man, that I wouldn't fight, that I'd see you as just another piece of bad luck and let it happen." His voice dropped to a whisper. "They were betting on me being a coward." "But you're not," she said, looking up at him. "No," he said, his jaw tight. "I'm not. Not anymore." He crouched in front of her, taking her hands in his. They were rough, calloused, but they were steady. "They underestimated you, Clara," he said, "and they underestimated me. They thought they were sending a lamb to the slaughter, but they were wrong." He squeezed her hands. "They sent a wolf to a wolf's door." In that moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't just about protection anymore. It was an alliance. Two survivors, two outcasts, pushed to the edge by a world that had tried to break them. But her father's plan had backfired in the most spectacular way. He hadn't just sent his daughter to a lonely rancher. He had delivered the one woman with the knowledge to destroy him to the one man with the strength to help her do it. The war wasn't over. It was just getting started. The next few days were a blur of work and whispered plans. Elias didn't treat Clara like a fragile victim. He treated her like a soldier. He took her to the barn and placed a shotgun in her hands. It was heavy, solid, smelling of oil and steel. "You can't see the target," he said, "so you have to learn to feel it, hear it." He taught her to listen for the snap of a twig, the shift of weight on the floorboards. He taught her how to aim toward a sound, how to feel the recoil of the gun in her shoulder, how to reload by touch in the dark. She learned fast. Her blindness, for so long a weakness, became her weapon. Her hearing was sharper than his. She could distinguish the sound of a man's breathing from the whisper of the wind. "You're a natural," he said one afternoon, his voice filled with a grudging respect. "I've been listening my whole life," she replied. "It's the only way I ever knew what was coming." One night, as they sat by the fire, cleaning their weapons, Clara finally asked the question that had been haunting her. "Your first wife," she said softly. "What happened to her?" Elias was silent for a long time. The only sound was the scrape of his knife against a whetstone. "Her name was Sarah," he began, his voice rough. We came out here with nothing but 2 horses and a dream. The land was hard. The winters were harder." He stopped, his hand stilling. "There was a sickness, a fever. It took her in 3 days. I was out on a cattle drive. By the time I got back—" He didn't have to finish. Clara reached out and placed her hand on his arm. His muscles were tight as coiled rope. "I buried her myself," he said, his voice a whisper. "Right out there, under that big cottonwood. After that, I just stopped living. I was just waiting." Waiting for what? He looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was so deep it felt like she was looking into his soul. "I don't know, but then you showed up." Something unspoken passed between them, a shared understanding of loss, of survival. The peace was shattered by the sound of a lone rider approaching the ranch at a gallop. Elias was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand, but the rider wasn't one of Miller's men. He was young, his face streaked with sweat and fear. He was one of the ranch hands from a neighboring property. "Mr. Ward," he gasped, reining his horse to a stop. "It's your father-in-law, Shaw. He's in town, with the sheriff. They've got a warrant for your arrest." Clara's blood ran cold. "For what?" "For kidnapping," the boy cried. "They're saying you stole his daughter. They're coming to take her back." It was a trap, a legal trap. They couldn't take her by force, so they were going to use the law as their weapon. Elias cursed, his mind racing. "How many of them?" "The sheriff, his deputy, and a dozen of your father-in-law's hired guns, all deputized for the posse." They were outgunned, outmaneuvered. Clara's world was collapsing again. They would drag her back. They would hand her over to Miller. Her defiance, her fight, it would all be for nothing. But then Elias turned to her, and his eyes were blazing with a wild, dangerous fire. "They want you back?" he said, a grim smile on his face. "Fine. Let's give them a wedding to remember." Before Clara could even ask what he meant, he was moving. He grabbed her hand. "Come on." "Where are we going?" "To the church," he yelled, pulling her toward the barn. "They want to see you handed over to a husband? By God, they'll see it. But it won't be the one they chose." The plan was insane. It was reckless. It was a fool's gamble. But as they rode hard toward town, the setting sun at their backs, Clara felt a surge of wild, terrifying hope. She was riding not to her execution, but to her own wedding, and her father was about to get the shock of his life. They thundered into town just as the posse was gathering in front of the sheriff's office. Dust flew, horses shied, people scattered. Elias pulled his horse to a dramatic stop right in front of her father, Charles Shaw. Clara sat behind him, her hands gripping his waist, her face set like stone. "Shaw!" Elias's voice boomed across the square. "You want to see your daughter married? You're just in time for the ceremony." Charles Shaw stared at them, his face a mask of confusion and rage. The sheriff, a portly man with a handlebar mustache, stepped forward, his hand on his pistol. "Ward, you're under arrest for kidnapping." "Kidnapping?" Elias laughed, a sound that held no humor. "Ask her yourself, Sheriff. Ask her if she came with me of her own free will." All eyes turned to Clara. She took a deep breath. "I did," she said, her voice ringing out, clear and strong. "I chose to leave. I choose to be here." A murmur went through the crowd that had gathered. "She's lying!" Shaw roared. "He's bewitched her. The only thing he's done is treat me like a human being," Clara shot back. "Something you never managed in 20 years. The sheriff looked uncertain. His gaze flickered from Shaw's furious face to Elias's defiant one. "We're getting married, Sheriff," Elias said, swinging down from the horse. He reached up and helped Clara down with a tenderness that made the crowd murmur again. "Right here, right now, and you're all invited to be witnesses." He strode toward the small church at the end of the street, pulling Clara with him. "Preacher!" he bellowed. "Got a wedding for you!" The town was in an uproar. Shaw and his men were momentarily stunned by the sheer audacity of it. The preacher, a thin, nervous man, came scurrying out of the church. "Elias, what in God's name is going on?" "Love, preacher," Elias said with a grin, "the kind that doesn't wait for permission." He turned to the crowd. "My wife-to-be's father seems to think he can sell her off like cattle, but this is a new day, and a woman has the right to choose her own husband. Is there any man here who disagrees?" Silence. A few of the townsmen shuffled their feet, but no one spoke. "Then let's get this done," Elias said. Shaw finally found his voice. "Stop this. I forbid it. She is promised to Thomas Miller." As if on cue, Thomas Miller himself pushed through the crowd, his face a thundercloud. "That's right. She belongs to me." Elias just smiled. "Does she now?" He turned to Clara. "Clara, you've got two men here who want to marry you. Your father's choice and your own. The law says you get to decide, so decide. In front of God and everyone." It was the ultimate gamble. He was putting her on the spot, forcing her to claim her own life in the most public way possible. Clara stood tall, her sightless eyes facing the direction of the voices. She didn't hesitate. "I choose Elias Ward," she said. The words hung in the air, a final, unbreakable declaration of her freedom. Miller's face contorted with rage. He drew his pistol. "If I can't have her, no one can." He fired. The crowd screamed, but the bullet never found its mark. Elias had moved with lightning speed, shoving Clara behind him and drawing his own gun. Two shots cracked through the air almost at the same time. Thomas Miller crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Elias stood over him, smoke curling from the barrel of his revolver. He hadn't even been grazed. The sheriff finally acted, his gun drawn. "Drop it, Ward." "It was self-defense, Sheriff," Elias said calmly, "and you all saw it." He let the gun fall to the dust. Charles Shaw stared at Miller's body, then at his daughter, standing defiant and alive. He had lost. In front of the entire town, he had lost. Without another word, he turned, climbed into his wagon, and rode away, his hired guns trailing behind him like a funeral procession. His power in this town was broken. Forever. Elias turned to the stunned preacher. "Well, are you going to marry us or not?" The preacher, pale and shaken, could only nod. They stood on the steps of the church, the setting sun casting long shadows behind them. The vows were simple and strong. When the preacher said, "You may kiss the bride," Elias turned to Clara. He didn't just kiss her. He held her face in his hands and kissed her with all the pent-up loneliness of a man who had thought he'd never feel anything again. He kissed her with the fierce pride of a man who had just watched the woman he loved claim her own soul. The town, which had gathered to witness an arrest, instead found themselves applauding a wedding. That night, back at the ranch, Clara stood on the porch, listening to the quiet sounds of the prairie. "You're really my husband," she said, a smile in her voice. Elias came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. "And you're really my wife." She leaned back against him. "They really did send me to the right man." He kissed the top of her head. "No, Clara," he whispered. "They sent me the only woman in the world strong enough to save me from myself." The joke had been on her family all along. They had sent away their greatest treasure, thinking it was worthless. But one man's trash, as they say, is another man's entire world. If you believe in the power of love to see the value others miss, then hit that subscribe button and join our community. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what part of this story touched you the most. Thanks for watching.